Hi, my name's Chrissy and I'm a recovering alcoholic. I had my last drink on July 31st of 2018 and my life has changed a heck of a lot since then. Um, just to take us back to the beginning a little bit, I had a pretty normal childhood. I definitely was never a kid or a young adult that anyone would have been particularly worried about having something like this happen to them. But addiction is the great equalizer and it can affect anybody. Um, my parents, we didn't have a liquor cabinet. I knew that there was some alcoholism that ran in my family. My parents made me aware of that, but it's not like it's not like it was something that I was exposed to early on or anything like that. I think it was just something that was there in me. And I also like to point out that I developed a pretty serious eating disorder when I was young, around, it became serious around 14. And I think that I bring that up because I feel like the two are definitely related in my case, at least, in that once I started giving myself permission to hurt myself in one way, I guess it sort of gave me permission to hurt myself in other ways. And it kind of is a slippery slope sometimes with things like that. But anyway, I didn't really start drinking. I drank a little bit when I was in high school, and every time that I did, I was a mess. I was right away not normal. It wasn't like fun, goofy. There were a lot of really embarrassing tears involved. But it didn't happen that much, probably because I didn't have access, honestly. And it makes sense because once I went to college and nobody was watching and I could get alcohol wherever I wanted, it pretty quickly became an almost daily occurrence. I mean, definitely on weekends, probably a few nights a week. I mean, I just really loved to party, and I was pretty high functioning for a really long time. I was a high achiever. I was studying to be a singer. It was my dream. I was certain that that was absolutely the right thing for me, and that it was like my destiny and everything. And I really struggled because my eating disorder also got really, really a lot worse when I went to college. And ultimately, I ended up taking a semester off in my second year because basically I was going to die. I mean, I just wasn't eating anything. And so I kind of ended up coming back to school a little bit, feeling some shame because I felt like everybody knew what had happened, even though in reality, like, frankly, I went to a big school. No one really gave a crap what I did. But, that's how it felt. And, I felt really my body, my eating disorder was maybe a little bit more under control, but I was super uncomfortable in my body. And I was kind of off to the races with my drinking. So, um, things went downhill pretty fast. I got a DUI that year. And I remember them requiring us to go to AA meetings, as like it was court ordered with my DUI. I was only 19 at this point, and I went to this meeting, and I remember this guy talking about how he was rotating, going to different liquor stores because he was embarrassed and didn't want the clerks to know that he was buying multiple bottles of liquor a day. And I remember just thinking, like, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard. I would never get that bad. And like, not only did I get that bad, but I got so bad that I just didn't stop rotating because I didn't even care anymore, if they knew. So, just to let you know how quickly you can deteriorate. So, anyway, at that point, at 19, I really still didn't see drinking as my problem. I was really young. I thought that the eating disorder was my problem and that if that got fixed, that kind of like everything else would work itself out. And that's just not what happened. I mean, really, I struggled through school. I managed to pull it off because I'm pretty smart and I was able to do school. Like I had that ability. And so I got through college miraculously with like good grades and everything, but I still felt like I had failed because even though I'd been able to get through and graduate, I hadn't done the things that I said I was going to do. accomplish the things that I wanted to accomplish because honestly, I had spent too much time partying. Um, and I was also really sick, and I didn't realize that at the time. I was still in my eating disorder, and I was an alcoholic, and I didn't know that yet. I realize now, like, how I drank really every night. And when I read my journal back then, I even talk about how I was drinking every night from the time I was like 19 on, and I still just didn't see that alcohol was the source of my problems. So anyway, when I left college and I felt like a failure, I did what we call a geographic, which is a geographic solution to your problems. And so I decided that I had never really wanted to be a musician, and I didn't really want to be a singer, and that wasn't my love, and I wanted to go be a lawyer instead. And I just like severed the limb, and I moved down to Washington, D.C. with my then partner, my then boyfriend, and I started working in law firms, and I started bartending at night and on weekends for extra money. And at first, it was really fun. It was really fast paced. And again, I was young. I could kind of pull it off. At that time, I started getting introduced to cocaine as well because it was just like something that was around and people had. And like, it felt exciting and seductive at the time, and it made me feel cool. And then, as with all things, it started going downhill. After a while, you can't sustain it anymore because your body can't take it. And so at this point, I was probably like 25-ish, and I still obviously hadn't gone to law school. I had already decided that wasn't what I wanted because, now I realize obviously I couldn't have pulled it off because I was at this point drinking every day, without a doubt every day. And I was starting to drink then during the day, like on my lunch breaks and everything, and all weekend, nonstop. And basically, I decided that I didn't want to go to law school anymore and that I wanted to go and become a chef. Because I did love to cook, and I do love to cook, but what I realize now is that I was picking a career that allowed me to go into the restaurant industry full time because that was where I was able to drink the way that I wanted to drink at that point in my life. When I worked in the restaurants, I was working behind a bar, I was drinking for free, people were buying me drinks, and I needed to justify leaving the responsible job to go and do that full time. And so that's what I did. And it was a disaster really quickly. Once I lost the structure of having to get up in the morning and use my brain and, look presentable, I very quickly deteriorated. And I was in this basically 2-year trap of waking up at 2 p.m. hungover, dry heaving and sick, dragging myself into work, immediately taking a couple shots because it was the only thing that would stop me from feeling sick. Getting through the shift, probably doing cocaine in order to help me get through the shift. Then staying up drinking with my coworkers late into the night until we passed out at like 4 or 5 in the morning. Rinse, repeat, wake up at 2 p.m. and do it all over again. And I lost years of my life in that horrible cycle, really not understanding what was happening and how seriously sick that I was. And in that time, the person that I was with at that point, we'd been together for like 5 years, he left me because I basically didn't exist anymore. I was just either asleep or drunk all the time. And so he left, and I had no idea what to do with myself. I couldn't hold down a job anymore. I'd gotten fired / quit or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? From my bartending job for being drunk and being obviously high while I was at work all the time. And I kept trying to get other bartending jobs, and I would be able to hold it together for like a month or so before it would just fall apart because I was drunk all the time. And eventually my body started to shut down. And I was getting really, really sick. I started getting withdrawals every day, and I was drinking around the clock. And I would say there was probably alcohol in my system for probably 2 years straight, and then at 28 years old, I don't know, there was no big there were a lot of horrible things that happened, but there wasn't one big horrible thing that made me one day realize that I had to break the cycle or I was going to die. I was actually drinking at the time. I was sitting at a bar and I had this really clear thought that I was stuck in a cycle and that there was only one way out. And that I had been stuck in it because I was too afraid of what was going to happen if I stopped drinking. And I decided in that moment that I didn't care what was going to happen. I was going to stop drinking right then, and I was going to grit my teeth and white knuckle it, and I was just going to get through it. And that was kind of a mistake because withdrawals from alcohol are very serious, which is something that I didn't realize. And when you've been drinking that heavily for a long time, it's not safe. But I was arrogant and I didn't want to ask for help, and I wanted to do it alone. And I almost died that first time around. Somehow, miraculously, my roommate at the time was home that day, which was something that never, at any other point in the time I lived there, had he ever been home, and saw me and pretty much insisted that I go to the hospital. And, when I got there, they basically told me that if I'd waited, I would have been lucky if I'd ended up in a coma. Like it was not a joke. And I was only 28, and I didn't think that that could happen to somebody who was that young. I thought that it only happened to like old men who'd been drinking for 60 years. But there I was, and I ended up having full on delirium tremens. I hallucinated. I punched nurses. It was a disaster. I spent a week in the ICU, and then I went to rehab. I spent 2 weeks in rehab and decided that everybody there was worse than I was, and that really I was just depressed, and that's why I drank. And if I just got a job again, that I would be fine and I wouldn't drink anymore. And so that's basically what I did, unsuccessfully. I relapsed a lot in those first 8 months when I got out, but I did end up going into, basically after I got out of rehab, I ended up in the emergency room a bunch of times because I met up with some of my rehab friends, and we all started drinking together, and it was just a big mess. But because of that, I ended up an outpatient at a place called Colmac in DC, which is a really great outpatient clinic. And because of them, I managed to get some sober time, and I strung together about 3 months, and I was pretty happy. And in that time, I managed to get a job that I really liked. And I started working at that job, and I felt like I was normal again and that my life was better. And obviously, because I was normal and employed and had an apartment and, you know, not drunk, that obviously I never had been an alcoholic, and it was all, I would be able to handle it this time because I would never risk losing this now. And I literally, there was wine in the fridge at my work that day, and I was told myself that it would be okay for me to have a glass of wine, and on the way out, I splashed a little bit into a cup and kind of cheersed myself at the end of the day. And that was it. That was all I drank for about a week. But I kept thinking about that splash of wine, and eventually it became a glass, and eventually it became more than a glass. And in a few weeks, I was right back to daily drinking again. And it was only a matter of time before I got really sick. And long story short, I devolved. I ended up in the psych ward, and I finally was ready to get some help. And at 29 years old, they told me that I was an end-stage alcoholic, and that if I ever drank again, it very well might kill me, and I became willing, and I did some things I needed to do, and I asked for help. And now I'm here today. I'm 20 months sober. It'll be 2 years in August, and it's a freaking miracle every day. And the amazing thing about it is that I wouldn't trade any of it now. I don't recommend going through something like this, but because I asked for help and because I get to live this life today, I feel very grateful. In a lot of ways, I feel like I've come back to life, and I have this second chance to kind of be a good person and appreciate what I have. And, at the end of the day, the things I have today that I'm grateful for that keep me sober are things that I always had. I just didn't know that I had them. So with that, I hope that if anybody is struggling or know somebody who's struggling, that you won't be afraid to ask for help, because it's the only way out of the cycle, and there is a very big, beautiful life on the other side of it all. Thanks for letting me share.